Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cosmos Society Online Open House Series, a production of Harvard University's Center for Hellenic Studies. I'm your host, Keith Stone, and today we are very pleased to welcome Armand D'Angour, who is Associate Professor of Classics at Oxford University and Fellow and Tutor at Jesus College. Among his other achievements, he was commissioned to compose odes in ancient Greek for the Olympic Games in Athens and London. And trained as a cellist and a pianist, as well as a classicist, he has recently reconstructed ancient Greek music from original documents on stone and papyrus. His new book, Socrates and Love, The Making of a Philosopher, will appear in just a few weeks from Bloomsbury. And his comments today, which is Valentine's Day, appropriately enough, will draw on the contents of this new book. So, dear Armand, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everyone, and thank you, Keith and Maria, for inviting me to talk about my new book, of which I've just received the hard copy, which is actually, the publication date is due, it's 7th of March, but I'm very pleased with the way it's looking at the moment. So it's called Socrates in Love, which of course is a title which will strike some as perhaps unduly romantic, and the subtitle is The Making of a Philosopher, because in the end I think that the connection between Socrates, love, and philosophy will become very clear. It's quite an iconoclastic book. I originally thought of writing a book about Socrates over 10 years ago. So in Oxford, one of the courses that I've been teaching for many years is called Greek Core, that's Greek literature of the 5th century BC. And two of the texts in that are Aristophanes' play Clouds, of which a character called Socrates is the central figure, and Plato's Symposium, in which of course Socrates figures heavily in a discussion with the other participants about the meaning of eros, or love. And one of the things that first struck me, as I say, about 10 years ago, was the sheer visual drama of the clouds. So in the play, you may remember, it begins with this old peasant, Strepsiades, who's tossing and turning in bed because he can't pay his debts, or rather the debts that have been run up by his spendthrift son, Pheidippides, who is absolutely mad about horses, and he keeps buying and maintaining these expensive beasts at his father's expense. And his father has run into debt as a result. And Strepsiades says, I don't know what to do about this, but I've heard that there's a school run by Socrates in which people learn to argue the worst case and win. So I'm going to send, I've got a great idea, I'm going to send Pheidippides off to this school so that he doesn't have to pay his debts, but he can learn to argue his way out of debt. So it's a great comic setup. And he says this to Pheidippides, his son, who says, you must be joking, I'm not going to go to that awful place where there are all these emaciated, long-haired intellectuals. You know, I'm much more interested in hanging around with the smart set, the knights of Athens. And so Strepsiades says, right, I'm going to go myself. And off he goes to the Thinkery, the Frontisterion, as it's called. He knocks on the doors of this school, and this very supercilious student says, you know, what do you want? And he says, you know, I'd like to learn about things. And the student says, well, you know, you're a silly old fool. Strepsiades says, what are you doing? You know, there are these students with their faces to the ground and their bottoms up facing the heaven. He said, you know, we're studying the heavens and we're studying what's below the earth. So there's this comic scenario of a group of students. And then suddenly in the far corner, he sees Socrates. Now, of course, this was an opportunity for Aristophanes to make fun of the mechane, the crane, the machina, the machine on which the gods were swung onto the stage at the end of tragedies like Philoctetes by Sophocles or the Orestes of Euripides. And here Aristophanes is in a way making fun of this because he brings Socrates in on the mechane. And so I was thinking, well, I wonder how this mechane worked, you know, some long wooden arm, and from that there's this rope suspended, and Socrates is in a basket apparently, and he's in the distance because the first words that Strepsiades utters, "O Socrates," or Socratidion, little Socrates. And I thought of that scene in Finding Nemo, where Dory sees a whale in the distance, and she says, "Hey, little fellow," because of course, from far away, a whale looks very small. So I thought, well, Socrates is out there in the distance, in the corner of the stage, and so Socrates says, "Hey, little Socrates over there, you know, I want to talk to you." And then Socrates gets swung into the center of the stage, and he says, "You know, I'm up here studying the heavens. You know, what do you want, you mortal man, down there?" And then you have this kind of catechism that continues thereafter. And I just thought, I mean, nobody tells us how these things really worked, but one assumes that a crane operator, we know about the crane operator, remember from Aristophanes' comedy Peace, in which Trygaius, the farmer, is flying up to heaven on a dung beetle to try and bring peace back down to earth. And the dung beetle is suspended on this crane, and Trygaius gets onto it as if he's Bellerophon on Pegasus, you know, this noble horse that's flying up to heaven. And then he gets whisked into the air, and he's going, "All right, you know, keep still, crane operator, otherwise I'm really going to shit myself, and then that beetle will get its dinner." So he breaks the fourth wall, and he's talking to the crane operator, this the chap who's actually operating. So I'm imagining there's some big slave there who's operating this great wooden arm. And I thought, wouldn't that make a great beginning for a play or a film even? Just the idea of a slave, you know, sweeping this arm across the stage, and on it is suspended this ridiculously comic figure of Socrates with his legs dangling from a basket, talking in this highfalutin way. Anyway, that was the image. It was also curious to me that the visual aspect of Socrates in the clouds was not really that we associate with Socrates as depicted in the Symposium, whereas you may remember at the end of that dialogue, Alcibiades bursts in and describes Socrates as a satyr, you know, sort of rather goat-like creature with unkempt hair, rather paunchy, and indeed in Xenophon's Symposium, he's similarly described. He's having a jocular discussion with a beautiful young man, Critoboulos, and he says, you know, so my nose is flared. It means it's better than yours because I can smell better. So my lips are thick. So what? I can kiss better. So I'm basically more fit for purpose than you are. So this older man, Socrates, and of course, one of the key points is that Plato and Xenophon, his main biographers, only knew him as an older man. They were born probably around 424. So let's say they were teenagers when they first really encountered and got to know this beloved teacher of theirs, let's say in 410. And in 410, Socrates, born in 469, was already nearly 60. So he would have been quite an older man. He would have lost his hair. He would have become quite paunchy. So in Xenophon's Symposium, he says, when I stopped fighting, I put on a bit of weight, and I'd like to get back to dancing to get fit again. So all those factors made me think, you know, we are missing somewhere the image of the younger man, both physically, visually, and also given that his main biographers are, as I say, they were young men when he was an old man, they were bound to have seen him in a very different light. Everybody knows that Plato essentially sanitizes Socrates' life and is somewhat hagiographic, and Xenophon much the same, though he provides a slightly different picture. So my first thought a few years ago was to write a book called Young Socrates. And one of the reasons for that actually was not just because of this sense that we need to go further back to try and understand what he was like as a younger man, but also because we do have about half a dozen rather important other sources of evidence for Socrates' life, which tend to be surprisingly neglected. So a very important one is Aristotle, who of course was Plato's pupil, but his father would have been roughly of the generation of Plato, and indeed Aristotle's pupil Aristoxenus, whose father Spintharus apparently knew the older Socrates. These people may have known something about Socrates' life, and they leave bits of evidence. But the most important of the external sources, and I begin one of my chapters with this, is a man called Ion of Chios, who was a direct contemporary of Socrates. And Ion was a polymath. He wrote poetry and philosophy, and he was involved in politics. He knew Pericles personally, didn't like him. He said he was an impudent young fellow. So Ion was more on the conservative side, probably in those days, and he was a friend of Cimon, for example. And no doubt Pericles was a bit of a lefty as far as he was concerned. But Ion, who, as I say, was an older contemporary of Socrates, wrote a book called Epidemiae, Travels, his travel journal. And in it, he writes that when Socrates was a young man, Neos, he traveled to the island of Samos. Now that's picked up by Aristoxenus, and he says, yeah, he traveled to Samos, and he was with the philosopher Archelaus, quite a well-known philosopher in Athens, so-called follower of Anaxagoras, who was Pericles' best friend, so in the circle of Pericles. And if, as a young man, Socrates went to Samos with Archelaus, this is then, this testimony is then added to in a way that has been so dismissed for no good reason. In a very casual way, Aristotle says, and Socrates and Archelaus were lovers. So he was Archelaus's paidika. And this testimony, it's not so much important for Socrates' sexuality as for his status, because you wouldn't be the lover of an important, high-ranking philosophical figure, friend of Pericles, unless you had some status, it seems to me, elite status. Interestingly, Porphyry, who picks up all this evidence, says, he gives us the date. He says Socrates was 17. So a lot of people have said this testimony refers to when Socrates fought on Samos with Pericles at the siege of Samos in 440. But then Socrates wasn't going to be Neos. He would already have been nearly 30 then. So I don't think he could be described as a young man. And the evidence accumulated shows that Socrates, when he was a teenager, was the paidika, the lover boy of Archelaus, a friend of Pericles, and he went with him to Samos, and we can guess why, because the big philosopher of the day in the 450s and 60s was Melissus, the Samian philosopher, the pre-Socratic philosopher. So you can imagine they probably went to visit Melissus in Samos. Anyway, this was part of the evidence that I wanted to bring in. So, in fact, Daniel Graham wrote a great article about Socrates on Samos in Classical Quarterly, I think in '93. And I remember reading that and thinking, gosh, we really do know something about the young Socrates. And this was going to be a key piece of evidence. But it also struck me that we need to think more about Socrates' early life and his elite status, because if he was in Pericles' circle, we don't hear a lot about it from Plato and Xenophon. And one of the things that then I uncovered, in a way to cut a long story short, was that in the 90s, Peter Bicknell wrote an article in which he analyzed an epigraphic discovery which showed that we could track the genealogy of the so-called mistress of Pericles, Aspasia, to an elite Athenian family, an Alcmaeonid family. She was the daughter of a man called Axiochus. Axiochus's other daughter was married to Alcibiades the Elder, and this is a man of elite Athenian background, Axiochus, who at some stage would have emigrated to Miletus. So there he is in Miletus in Asia Minor at a time when it's quite an interchange. You may remember the Athenians and the Milesians considered themselves kin, to the extent that when the tragedian Phrynichus wrote a play about the sack of Miletus, which showed their suffering, the Athenians were burst into tears, and they banned the play and fined the playwright. 494 sack of Miletus. So Axiochus is in Miletus. He meets Alcibiades the Elder, that is the grandfather of the famous young man, and Alcibiades marries his daughter. We don't know her name. And then Alcibiades is exiled from Athens. We know he was ostracized. He was obviously quite a successful politician. That's inevitably going to get you ostracized. And he was sent into exile in 460. And he went to Miletus, and he came back 10 years later, bringing his wife, who was the mother of his son Cleinias, the general, and bringing his wife's sister, Aspasia. So I think this stuff has been worked out. It's generally accepted. That amazing book, The People of Plato, if you look up Aspasia, it will give you, Deborah Nails's book will give you the background and the epigraphic evidence and so on. And she accepts that Aspasia did come from this elite Athenian family. So she came to Athens in 450, and she would have been about 20 then. And so was Socrates. So there am I trying to imagine a situation where this young Socrates is meeting this astonishingly clever, beautiful young woman at the age of 20. They're both 20. And it's clear that she was married to Pericles, or at least together with Pericles, by about 445. There's a 5-year gap. And Pericles in 445 was 50. So we have to reverse the standard image of Socrates and Pericles. And there's a wonderful 19th century painting by a Frenchman called Monsieur, a neoclassical painter, in which he shows a gorgeous young soldier looking deeply into the eyes of a beautiful young woman, and that's Pericles and Aspasia. And at the table is this grisly old man who's Socrates. But that's actually chronologically incorrect. Pericles was twice the age of Socrates and Aspasia when she got together. For the sake of argument, let's say she married him in 445. But between that period, these two young people were together in Athens. And as I've said, Socrates was already in Pericles' circle. And of course, Alcibiades the Elder was his relative. Cleinias, their son, was his friend, Pericles' friend. So it seems to me they would have met. Now, that's all speculative. It's to do with chronology and coincidence and so on. But what I wanted to do was to look into why Socrates became Socrates. What we have is this picture of this older man who, as Cicero said, brought philosophy down from heaven to earth. If you look at the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus or Parmenides or Thales, Anaximander, all those people, they're either the physicoi, the people who thought about the world and what's it made of. Is it water? Is it air? Is it something infinite or apeiron? Or even fire or logos in the case of Heraclitus. But what Socrates did was he said, well, these questions are not of interest to me. What I want to know is what's the best way to live? What is the good life? What is truth? What is justice? What is knowledge? And what is love? These are the questions that we want to know the answers to. And we may never find them. But philosophy is about pursuing Sophia. It's not about being wise. It's about constantly asking these questions. And in Plato's Phaedo, he actually says, I used to be interested in those physical matters. What does the brain consist of? What is, how does it work? How does our physique work? How does the world work? But he said, I gave all that up. He said, Anaxagoras, again, this friend of Pericles, a very close mentor of his perhaps for 30 years. He says, Anaxagoras published his book about nous, mind, and I rushed out to the Agora and I bought it for a drachma. And I was so disappointed because it said nothing about how we should live best. Mind was a kind of mechanical principle that sets the world in motion. So the evidence was always there that Socrates was at some stage, and as a pupil of Archelaus and someone who would have heard Anaxagoras, you can expect this to be the case, at some stage interested in philosophy of that kind, but he changed to become interested in much more humanistic questions. So in my mind, he must have had some kind of personal experience which made him think that those other questions were more important. And one of the key texts for that, of course, is the Symposium, because there Socrates more or less denies what his whole philosophical life consists of, which says, the one thing I know is that I do not know, and says, actually, the one thing I do know about is love. So I'll tell you the truth about love, he says, to his various interlocutors, the other people who've given the speeches at the beginning, the first third of the Symposium. He says, look, after Aristophanes gives his wonderfully comic discourse about love being us trying to find our other half. Humans originally had four arms, 4 legs, and then Zeus split them in two, like slicing an egg with a wire, slicing a boiled egg with a wire, and then everyone tried to graft themselves back to find their original whole nature. And so that's what love is. It's trying to find your missing other half. Very lovely story and a seductive idea, but one that has lots of problems. In particular for Socrates, if it's just finding one's other half and going back to some kind of happy, self-satisfied omnipotence, then you're never going to learn. And life is all about pursuing knowledge, philosophia. And so what you need is not to find your other half, but to find someone who can draw out from you the wisdom that is already in you, the true meaning of education. So he then says, after Socrates gives his speech, he says, look, I'm not going to give a speech about Eros. I'm going to tell you the truth about love. I know this, he says, because I learned it from a very clever woman. And her name was Diotima. So we have this idea that sometime, presumably in his youth, Socrates heard Diotima speak, and she then goes on to give her doctrine about love not being about worldly sexual love. It is initially, but you go up the ladder until it becomes about the thing that is lovable in itself, goodness and truth and beauty. And so you get this sense that it's transcendent, and you also get the sense that you can't talk about being in love or loving someone unless you define your terms. And both these things, the idea that you define, say what love is before you tell me what what you feel, as it were. Tell me what is love, and then I'll tell you that it's about something transcendent. It's not about worldly love. Both these aspects of what Diotima says are very clearly Socratic. We understand them as Socratic, definition of terms and transcendence of ideas. So most scholars have said that when we're told that Aspasia discoursed on love and said similar things. So we have Aeschines, a pupil of Socrates, writing an Aspasia, which is lost, but cited in Cicero. And Cicero describes that Aspasia was a kind of love coach, a therapist or counselor who Socrates and his friends used to go and talk to about love. And she said that in order to be the best, to have the best spouse, you need to be the best of spouses. That was one of the things she said. So this kind of moral imperative, that testimony to what Aspasia was supposed to have said has always been written off as projecting Socratic thinking onto her, rather than what it actually says, which is that she said those things, and Socrates, now I think Socrates in his 20s, went away and thought, you know, she's onto something. So how can I then think about the symposium as a Diotima who is generally considered to be a fiction? How can I suppose that she might be a real person? Basically because Socrates in the symposium introduces her with this incredibly curious claim. And I think it may be on the handout that I gave you. He says, she was a very clever woman. She said, I know all about love. There's one thing I know about. I'll tell you the truth. I learned it from Diotima. She was a clever woman, Sophia. And amongst other things, when the Athenians were sacrificing to ward off the plague, pro loimu, she managed to delay it for 10 years. Now, why the hell would you make such a precise and specific introduction to a fictional person called Diotima? Well, I think that's because Plato knew who he was talking about. And what amazes me is that no one has ever done the maths. And it's very simple. She delayed the plague by 10 years. We know when the plague at Athens happened, 430 BC. That was the plague, and it killed Pericles and his sons. So she delayed that by 10 years. So what was happening 10 years earlier, which required the plague to have happened then, but it didn't because someone had managed to delay it? 440. We know what happened in 440. The most salient event of 440 was Pericles' invasion and siege of Samos, and Duris of Samos, the later ruler and historian of the island, gives us some detail about how, having won the war both by sea and by land, Pericles crucified the commanders and he threw out their bodies without burial. So what should have happened in 440? I think all the Athenians immediately knew. You don't have to watch Antigone or Oedipus to know that if someone commits such a transgression, the gods are going to punish you. And they'll probably punish you with a plague. And if you get a plague, as at the beginning of the Iliad, what you must do to try and avert it, of course, is sacrifice to the god. And what must have happened, in my view, and what this all points to, is that after Pericles' terrible action of throwing out these men unburied, the Athenians did indeed sacrifice. And lo and behold, no plague transpired in 440. So 10 years later, when it did, they said someone must have delayed it. Now, who is that someone? And if it's a clever woman, who could that clever woman be? There is literally no other clever woman in the picture other than Pericles' beloved wife or mistress Aspasia. And of course, Aspasia had anyway been blamed for the siege of Samos. She was said by the comic poet to have been the evil genius that had persuaded Pericles to go to war with the rival city of her hometown Miletus. So Aspasia then comes clearly into the picture. And when I had worked that out, I thought, that's amazing. Is Plato actually hinting that we should know that Diotima is this woman? Well, the other thing that the comic poets do is they give nicknames, both to Pericles and Aspasia. And Pericles' nickname for most of his political career was Zeus. So he was called the Olympian orator, he thundered, he made laws. And the other thing that we know about Pericles and Aspasia, we learned from Plutarch, was that he gave greater honor to her than any man was seen to do to his wife in Athens. He kissed her when she went out in the morning, he went out in the morning, and when he returned at night. He honored her greatly. So once you put two and two together, you get the name honored by Zeus, or honoring of Zeus, Diotima, And it seems to me that my minimal claim must be that any Athenian reading the Symposium, roughly contemporary, would immediately have known that this related to Aspasia. So that's my big discovery in the book. I think it's important because if, as I say, the doctrine that Aspasia promotes to Socrates is something that we go on and find Socrates elaborating in the course of his philosophy, this idea of transcendence of ideas and importance of definition, then the embryo of those ideas might well have been something that in his youth he was introduced to by this very clever woman. I think we need therefore to rehabilitate Aspasia as the founder of Western philosophy. I think I've spoken enough.
That's a great concluding sentence, I have to say. Let me just adjust a couple things. All right. Wow, it sounds so simple when you explain it like that. Do I have any questions? Astrid, go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I read not long ago in a book called Philosophers and Love that the Western idea of love comes directly from the Symposium. I would like to know if you agree with that statement. And if it's so, I have always thought that half of the humanity, I mean women, was left out of the discussion. But when you talk about Diotima and Aspasia, it's like truth is being spoken by the mouth of a woman. I don't know if I'm being far-fetched, I'm just far-fetching or reading what I want to read, and I would like to know your opinion about it. Thank you.
Okay, well, there are 2 points that you made. One is the Western idea of love. Well, first of all, of course, there are probably dozens of different ideas of love that we have today, and indeed dozens of different ideas of love that are presented in the Symposium. So which idea are we talking about? Let's say the idea of romantic love. Well, yes, there is a certain degree of romantic love in some of the early speeches, the man who will die for his beloved, or the beloved who will die for his erastes. So some of that, no doubt, love, human beings love in certain ways, and quite a lot of them are explored in the Symposium. I don't think this idea that there's any direct connection between the Symposium and our ideas of love holds much validity. People aren't going around reading the Symposium in order to learn what love's about. But if you're talking about the philosophy of love, of course, it is the earliest and greatest discourse on the subject. So that's my answer to that. Essentially, yes, it's the earliest document from which philosophical ideas of love have emanated. But there are all sorts of other expressions like poetry. I would say the kind of love, for example, presented by Catullus in his poems, that passionate romantic infatuation. Other kinds of love that we find throughout ancient literature might have been just as germane to modern ideas, if any literature was. But the other question is the absence of women in the Symposium. Well, that's a really quite important point. And first of all, it speaks to, I think, the situation that did prevail in ancient Athens, where you had groups of men meeting together in symposia. In the Symposium of Plato, at least one couple are lovers, Agathon and Pausanias. Others are close friends, Eryximachus and Phaedrus, the younger man. They've known each other for a long time. And others are somewhat loners, like Aristophanes. Socrates, of course, is the erastes, supposedly, of Alcibiades. But the whole point Alcibiades makes is that I tried to seduce him rather than the other way around. He rejected this, or he didn't. He was more interested in my soul than my body. And therefore, you get this notion of platonic love, people who could have a sexual loving relationship, but don't do so for higher reasons, whatever that is. So men, but they're all men, except for Diotima, who is a woman. And there's been a tremendous amount of ingenuity expended on why Diotima, maybe the whole point is that a woman is symbolic of giving birth, of fecundity. And remember that the ultimate definition of love that she gives is tokos en kalor, giving birth, being productive in relation to the beautiful. And whereas she says that, you know, that isn't just producing children off the back of someone beautiful, not so much the back, but anyway, actually being productive in relation to beauty itself. So producing logoi, for example, ideas, beautiful thinking, can be the result of intercourse, interchange between two people who have this relationship. So I now think that quite a lot of that ingenuity, why is Diotima a woman? And of course, I think there is an article of that very title, is misplaced. I think she's a woman because she was a woman, and that Socrates did say, and Plato had heard him say, I learned the one thing I know about, which is love, from Aspasia. But I don't think Plato wanted to tell us that for various reasons. First of all, throughout most of his lifetime, Aspasia had been written off as a prostitute and a brothel keeper. And if you look at any modern literature on Aspasia, she is almost universally described as a hetaira, a courtesan, the most famous hetaira of antiquity. And hetairae, we know, were these highly paid escorts, and they had the right to perhaps run brothels and so on. And one assumes, because all the scholars have called her a hetaira for hundreds of years, that ancient sources do so as well. So you look in the ancient sources, and how many mentions you get that identify Aspasia as a hetaira? None. So that is an extraordinary thing that scholarship seems to have overlooked. She was never a high-class prostitute. She wasn't a prostitute at all. The only people who call her a prostitute, a porne or a palake, a concubine, are the comic poets. And people have taken that seriously. And Plato, in his Menexenus, a really odd dialogue, shows Aspasia teaching Socrates how to give a speech. And the speech is one that she says she once taught to Pericles, his funeral speech. And everybody has said, guess what? Plato's joking. So the philosopher's joking, the comic poets are deadly serious. And that's what the situation has been for hundreds of years. And the scholarship has come to terms, has accommodated this notion that the woman who was married to Pericles for 16 years, perhaps from 445 till his death in 429, when he was leading Athens, who instigated all these wars, not just the Samian War, but the Peloponnesian War, if you were to believe Aristophanes' Acharnians, that this woman was keeping a brothel on the side. It was clearly complete nonsense. And indeed, there's a wonderful story about her having been taken to law by Hermippus. And Hermippus was a one-eyed comic poet who had a go at Pericles for being a lustful man, and clearly must have had a go at Aspasia for being somehow, well, for procuring, he says, she was taken to court for procuring free-born women for Pericles. I mean, this absurdity that there she is, this brothel-keeping woman, you know, getting free-born women who come, no doubt, to listen to her along with their husbands and saying, look, you know, you go along and Pericles will have his way with you. That seems to have been believed. That she could then have been taken to court for that is another absurdity, because all the investigations I've done on Athenian law suggest that a woman didn't have legal rights in that way in any case. It would have had to be her kurios, her husband or guardian, who would have been taken to law. And so the whole thing falls apart. The idea that anybody could have taken seriously the idea that a comic poet actually brought a case against Aspasia, one for impiety and two for procuring, is a complete absurdity. And yet people take these things seriously. So I've basically ditched all that nonsense and tried to look at the historical realities that I think emerge. Yes, I can
Go
see the
ahead,
question.
Bill.
So, because my image of Socrates is as an old guy, so what do we actually know about his marriages and his relationships when he was younger?
That's also terribly important, because most people who know something about Socrates think, oh yeah, of course, he was married, wasn't he? He was married to Xantippe. Famously, she was a difficult woman. She was a shrew. She gave him a hard time. And, you know, there are these stories about her emptying a pot of, a chamber pot over Socrates because he was late for something, late for dinner, I'm not sure. So Socrates married Xantippe, and then Plato, in the Apology and in the Crito and in the Phaedo, in all three dialogues, he mentions Xantippe and the three children. But we know from the Phaedo that she came to the jail, 399 BC, holding the youngest one, Lamprocles, in her arms. So Lamprocles would have been a baby in 399. Okay, well, let's take Xantippe as being able to give birth as late as 30. I mean, it seems unlikely that she'd have been much older. So let's say she was 30 in 399. When would Socrates have met and married her? Possibly when she was 20 in 409. Possibly when she was 17 in 412. Possibly even, you know, we can speculate. In fact, there are some testimonies which say that when Xantippe married Socrates, she was a bit too old, so she had missed the boat. Now, in Athens, what we know is that engui, this marriage agreement, happened quite early. It could happen as early as 12 or 13, and then the wife would move into the oikos. They'd have a gamos, they'd actually have a wedding ceremony, which perhaps was secondary, perhaps at the age of 15 or 16. So let's say Xantippe had missed the boat and she was 20 when she met Socrates, or perhaps was introduced to him, perhaps even by a matchmaker like Aspasia. And she would have been 20, let's say, as we've tried to work out her age, if she was born in, say, 430, she would have met him in 410. And that was when Plato would have been a youngish man, Xenophon was a youngish man, perhaps when they first met him. That's what they knew. He's married to this woman, Xantippe, or he's with her. But Socrates was not a virgin until the age of 50 or 55 when he met her, or even 60. You know, we have some good descriptions from later sources about how he was a vigorously sexual young man. They say until he took the philosophical path and then he calmed down. So these are strange later sources, but they go back to Aristoxenus, and Aristoxenus was Aristotle's pupil, and Aristotle, of course, knew things about Socrates that Plato probably didn't want to say. And so that's the other thing. Aristotle contradicts Plato in about 20 places. Not huge contradictions, but small enough contradictions for us to think Aristotle thought, well, Plato got it wrong, and maybe he just wanted to set the record straight. And one of the things he says is, of course, Socrates married Myrto when, well, what he says was he married Myrto, and his first two sons, whose names were Menexenus and, well, Sophroniscus after his father, and Menexenus, were those of Myrto. And Myrto, he says, we know who she was. She was the daughter of Lysimachus, who was from the same deme, Allopeke, from which Socrates and his father came. And Lysimachus was said to have been Sophroniscus's best friend, that is, the best friend of Socrates' father. So that means Myrto would have been Socrates' own generation, which means he would have married her, say, when he was 20 and she was 20, and they would have had two sons, possibly who were grown up by the time she died and he moved on to marry, or at least we don't think he married, actually. He became the lover of this much younger girl, Xantippe, and then had a further son from her. So that's how I reconstruct it. And I think that Aristotle's testimony does add up to us thinking that he was married to an aristocratic woman, and this again comes back to his status as a young man, Lysimachus was the son of Aristides the Just, Aristides Hodikaios, a war hero, an Alcmaeonid. So if Socrates married her, and he did so when he was young, he was part of an elite circle even at that stage. And so I think that's the picture we have to draw, that Socrates was clearly bisexual. So Plato portrays him in the Lysis and the Charmides as fancying the hell out of some young man. He sees Charmides, the ketone is drops from his chest. And Socrates says, I felt bestial desire at the sight of this young man's chest. So I don't think there's any secret that Socrates had homosexual desires and almost certainly liaisons. As an ancient writer said, okay, if he didn't sleep with Alcibiades, he was a fool. If he did, this is what you'd expect him to have done. And I think that the fact that Plato goes out of his way to portray Alcibiades saying, look, I tried my best and he didn't do it, is indicative that we are expected to be surprised that Socrates didn't do that. He was someone who was lustily and happily bisexual probably most of his life. And so he marries Xanthippe when he's 55 or 60. And that's, one of his late flings. But the early marriage, I think, is important because, again, it reminds us of his background, which I think must have been a lot more elite than people give credit for. And the reason we don't, of course, is because we have this image of the older man walking around barefoot and in rags. But Socrates himself says in the Apology, I chose poverty. I chose poverty when I followed my calling. You wouldn't have been the first or the last philosopher to do that.
So you said that Myrto was the same generation as Socrates. And this would have been about when they were 20. So Aspasia would also have been on the scene at about the same age at the same time, if I remember.
Well, exactly.
What you were saying earlier.
So what I think is that, all right, let's be romantic about it. Let's speculate. Let's do a film, and I hope a film will be made of this. But in the film, what will happen is that the young Socrates meets the young Aspasia in 450. They're both 20. They fall in love. And by the way, that's not just speculation. Clearchus, pupil of Aristotle, very learned man, testimony of Clearchus, before Aspasia was with Pericles, sine genito, she was with Socrates. Now, we don't know what was a companion of, was a friend of, associated with, was the lover of. Let's say the latter. So 20-year-old Aspasia, 20-year-old Socrates, both odd. Socrates, of course, hearing voices, something no doubt physiologically wrong with him, stands still for long periods in the street. It's probably some kind of cataleptic seizure. He is atopos. That's the word often used of him. He's hard to place, both in terms of his status and his personality. He's a loner. He's eccentric. He's out there. And so is Aspasia. Highly educated, brilliant, clever, prepared to hold salons for the young men of Athens who want to learn about marriage and love. And they meet, they fall in love, but Pericles can't keep his eyes off this beautiful young woman. And between 450 and 445, he makes his intentions clear. And in 445, Aspasia says to Socrates, I am going with Pericles. Cue Catullus. But Socrates, being a different kind of person, first of all, takes to heart what Aspasia says, because he says, all right, let's put a dialogue into this. But Aspasia, but I love you. Socrates, what is love? It's not just about the fact that you fancy me, not the fact that you want to be with me. It's about much higher things than that. I'm going with Pericles. At which point, Socrates, 25-year-old, goes back and his dad says to him, look, Socrates, I told you there's this woman, Myrto, Aristides. I know he's fallen on hard times. Famously, he didn't have a penny, this war hero. She's not going to be able to give you a dowry. Aristotle tells us that. No dowry from Myrto. But you should marry her. She's good for you. Socrates marries Myrto. Okay, that's my theory.
I wondered
go ahead,
if you had a theory about her Aspasia's teaching rhetoric. Socrates was famously or notoriously a good public speaker, as was Pericles, and the Menexenus character, I suppose, is Socrates' son.
No, no, because Socrates makes some inappropriate sexual comment about, I'll charismai you, I'll gratify you, I'll even strip naked and dance for you if you want, he says. So
oh, okay, so there's not the son. Okay,
no,
another
probably,
Menexenus.
we know another Menexenus from Plato's Lysis, who is a young man who's not related to Socrates. It's probably that Menexenus.
Oh, well, thanks for clearing that up. But the funeral oration in Thucydides and the Menexenus speech do have a lot of common qualities of glorifying, Athens, the philosophy that the bedrock of Athenian democracy. How do you see that?
I see it, as we are told in the Menexenus, that Aspasia helped Pericles write that speech. I see nothing wrong with that, and I think that the evidence is there from that, as you say, the connections between the way the speech is presented in the Menexenus. Of course, some of these things are generic. This is how you will praise your city. But I think there's some interesting things that haven't been noticed in the funeral speech in Thucydides that strike me as rather curious. One of them is that Pericles says at one point, you should look on your city and you should be lovers of it, erastai. I mean, what an extraordinary kind of erotic image. We should be lovers of your city, as if he's ticking off people who are lovers of other things. And so I think I think the speech needs to be mined, and I suspect that we can find there will be things of that kind which relate it to the Aspasia-Socrates nexus. So, I mean, one of the other things that famously Pericles says is the person who doesn't involve himself in civic life, I don't consider to be just a private citizen, idiotes, but useless, achrestos, or whatever. And you can just imagine that, having decided that she is going to make her bed with Pericles, Aspasia is furious that Socrates, this clever, eloquent man, absents himself from civic duties. And basically, he does nothing for Athens in civic terms other than fighting, which he certainly does do, but he does nothing in the political arena until 406 BC, when he is appointed Prytany at a very sensitive moment after the Battle of Arginusae, and the generals are being tried en masse for not picking up the bodies of the dead and the wounded. One of those generals is Aspasia and Pericles' son, Pericles Jr., and he's executed. And you can just imagine, Aspasia must have been spare with worry, and she must have gone to the Prytany of the day and said, look, Socrates, do what you can. And Socrates does. And he tries to move that it is illegal to try these generals en masse, but they shout him down and they execute 6 of the generals. And then they regret it, we're told. Of course, the Athenians regretted having done this. But anyway, Socrates and civic engagement is something that I think Pericles' funeral speech refers to. En passant, I mean, he's not specifically saying this, but that kind of person. So I think there may be a number of different connections which allow us to see in that speech some kind of influence by Aspasia, which is exactly what we're told by Plato's Menexenus.
Any other questions? Do I see a hand up, Sarah? Yeah.
Yes, it's actually a question from somebody who's viewing on YouTube and wondering about Xenophon's mentions of Socrates and Aspasia in the Memorabilia and Economics, and wonders, is Xenophon being ironic?
Well, no, I think not. And I mean, once again, you know, Xenophon never says that Aspasia was a hetaira. So I think it's in the Memorabilia where Socrates says, I'll introduce you to Aspasia, who will tell you all about how husbands and wives should get on. Or she is a teacher of eloquence as well, I think, for this, is it this, the son of Callias, something like that. Essentially, where she is mentioned, she's mentioned in respectful terms. So I think Xenophon has also recognized that Aspasia is not simply some porne, some palake, some hetaira, but someone who can be treated with respect and taken seriously as a thinking woman. And that's what comes across. And interestingly, I think it's also the Memorabilia where you have Socrates engaging in conversation with Pericles Jr., the son of Pericles and Aspasia, which again goes to, I think, confirm my theory that he was closer to the circle of Pericles than is generally thought or generally recognized. And I think that closeness, of course, is most clearly indicated by his intimacy with Alcibiades, who was Pericles' ward when his father Cleinias died when he was 5 in 447 BC, the Battle of Coronea. So a lot of these things are coming together, and I think Xenophon's evidence supports pretty well my whole revisionist theory about Socrates.
Georgia, did I see that you have a question also?
Sorry, you have.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that you gloriously restored the reputation of Aspasia. So that was a very pleasant moment. Actually, there is a bronze relief from Pompeii where Pericles and Aspasia are together, but they're depicted kind of the same level. The same level, not only symbolically, one could say that, you know, they were at the same mental or intellectual status, but now with your with this background, we can let's say follow up a common historical path.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yes, I'd love to see that. I'm not aware of that release, so thank you.
Yes. If I just ask Sarah, or forward to Sarah, and she can, or I can forward it, and I can give you the hint. It's not a problem. May I ask a question? Why do you think the persona of Diotima was necessary?
So I address this in my book.
Yes.
I think that Plato... Yeah, I mean, interesting question, because, of course, he is quite happy to mention Aspasia in the Menexenus, but he's not happy to mention her. He gives this disguise, I think, in the Symposium. And there are a number of possible reasons for it. And I suggest a couple in my book. I think one of them is that this is an absolutely central part of Socrates' thinking. As far as Plato is concerned, his doctrine of love was crucially important to everything that Socrates did and thought. And I think that although he may have heard Socrates actually say, I was taught all about love from this very clever woman, Aspasia, Plato would have thought, he won't be taken seriously if I have Aspasia teaching him about that. They might take me seriously if I have a dialogue in which he teaches him how to give a funeral speech. But, you know, that's one possibility. Another is, of course, that the doctrine of love reaching the notion of the ideas is something that Plato himself might have elaborated on Socrates' initial thinking. Of course, we just don't know whether Socrates himself was such a firm believer in the theory of ideas that Plato goes on to elaborate in Republic and so on. So I also think that Plato felt that Aspasia was too vexed a figure to introduce at that Symposium well, within the story of the symposium, it's easier to talk about this priestess having an inspired notion. Of course, she's a mantis, she's a seer. Love is a mystery. Quite explicitly, he makes Diotima talk about it as a mystery. And for all I know, Aspasia said it was a mystery. For all I know, Aspasia held sacrifices and considers herself a somewhat religious person. You know, we don't know what elements of Diotima we can put back onto Aspasia. I mean, given that she was put on trial for Aspasia, impiety, at one stage, apparently, you know, maybe she did dabble in things that were seen to be of a religious nature. Anyway, all these, in the end, you can speculate until the cows come home, but the fact is that if you believe that there's some validity in that identification, you can find quite a few reasons as to why Plato wouldn't have wanted to make it explicit, but at the same time, didn't quite want to leave it to guesswork. So I think he gives us this very strong clue, both in the name and in the introduction, and then it's up to us to decide what we think.
Thank you. Well, our hour is about up, so I should thank you, first of all, for that wonderful talk, and thank you for all your answers.
Thank you very much.
And for the rest of you, I hope you'll join us again soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye now.